I am Estella Cohen, Senior Privacy Consultant at TrustArc, and serve as a member of the IAPP Canadian Advisory Board. I have the pleasure of introducing our next keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Geist. He is a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce law. He has written numerous academic articles and government reports on the Internet and law, and was a member of Canada's National Task Force on Spam. He is the editor of In the Public Interest, The Future of Canadian Copyright Law, which was published in 2005 by Irwin Law. He is also the editor of several monthly technology and law publications, and the author of a popular blog on the internet and intellectual property law issues. Please join me in welcoming to the stage one of Canada's best-known voices on privacy issues, Michael Geist.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks so much for the invitation. This is a room, as I was even walking around in the back earlier on, this is a room filled with people who I have worked with, who I have long admired, followed, not in the creepy sense, but followed, and in terms of the leadership that we've seen from so many people. And so it's a real honor and a pleasure to have the chance to come and speak. So I've titled this talk, PIPEDA at 20. It's a time for PIPEDA 2.0. As many of you will know, or perhaps not thought a lot about, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the introduction of PIPEDA. It was in the fall of 1998 as part of the OECD Ministerial on Electronic Commerce, when the federal government at the time was looking to make a splash from a policy perspective. It introduced a number of different things, and one of them would become the legislation that was PIPEDA. And from my perspective, that arc and that timeline resonates quite a lot today, because at the time, much of the emphasis was, I guess, partially on that OECD ministerial, but even more, it was on what was taking place in Europe and the directive and the pressure that Canada, like many other countries, was facing with respect to our own set of privacy rules. And up until, I suppose, about 15 minutes ago, when suddenly now everyone is just thinking about their next 8 months and consent-related rules, up until that moment, I think that the focus for many in the room, indeed the focus for many in this conference, is the GDPR. This was from this morning. It's now about 10 hours away, I think. And so there's been an enormous amount of attention, not on our law, but rather on the European law. And part of that, of course, is that our inbox is nowadays filled with messages about the GDPR reminiscent of what we faced here in Canada with respect to CASL, the anti-spam legislation, and it also reflects this conference. And there are an amazing array of panels, including many on the GDPR. Many of you will walk out of this and attend one of these two panels that are focused on GDPR, and there are many more that run throughout the course of the next 2 days. And while I recognize the importance of focusing and thinking about that legislation and its implications for Canada, I have to admit, it makes me a little sad to be thinking about someone else's law. Yes, it's important, and yes, it has implications for us. But I think much like in 1998, when there was that pressure to think about someone else's law and how we might ensure that ours met the standard, I kind of wish that we would be spending more time thinking about our own legislation. Now, I think the Commissioner just did some of that within the current construct, and a lot of the discussion that I think will follow, whether on consent or different sorts of practices, are critically important. But I note that he was cautious to emphasize that this is guidance that fits within the existing framework. And I guess what I want to emphasize a little bit is whether or not we have the opportunity, indeed the necessity, to try to change that framework itself. Recognizing that 1998 doesn't feel that long ago, I must admit to me, but nevertheless it is a long time ago, a time that people weren't thinking as much about privacy, I think it's fair to say, and in the current environment, so many Canadians, so many people around the world are today identifying privacy, particularly online privacy and some of the digital issues, as a significant concern. A time that obviously predates the commercial emergence of Google or of social media or of Edward Snowden. It's a different world from a privacy perspective from the one that existed back when we first introduced our own legislation. And it seems to me that many of the kinds of issues that have emerged can be made to fit. We've just seen an illustration of trying to do that. But I'd argue that I think we can do better from a legislative perspective. Indeed, even from some of the examples that we just heard from the Commissioner, the future is now with respect to issues that a decade or more ago we might have talked about as something in the distance. There is the Sidewalk Labs initiative. I should note that I'm the interim chair of a digital advisory panel for the Toronto waterfront side of the story, but I'm speaking for, we haven't even met yet, but I'm just speaking obviously on my own behalf. But that notion of smart cities and how it fits within privacy rules, especially when you can bring in federal commissioners, but there's provincial commissioners, there's a range of other areas, doesn't necessarily fit neatly within our legislative framework. Artificial intelligence, AI, is on the tip of everybody's tongue right now, and so too some of the privacy issues that come alongside of it. And of course, the implications of trade and privacy, an issue that frankly wasn't at all on the agenda in terms of incorporating privacy-related issues within trade agreements, is the sort of thing we didn't think about 2 decades ago. But as we seek to renegotiate NAFTA and conclude this now, the CPTPP, tabled just this week in the House of Commons, containing provisions that have direct implications for some of our privacy rules, our future is really now with some of these issues. Now, 20 years under PIPEDA, I'm not going to spend 20 years cycling through everything that we've experienced over the last 2 decades, but to pick up on a theme again that the Commissioner raised, it seems to me that we have generally been more reactive than proactive. And we didn't plan this, but it is great to hear the office emphasizing the notion of taking a more proactive approach. I want to talk about being more proactive, not in the context of the advice that we might get from a regulator, but rather being more proactive in terms of what the rules themselves look like from a legislative perspective. We have had a tendency, I would argue, in Canada to be very reactive. Events happen, and so we call people before parliamentary committees, or we have commissioners or other authorities say that they're going to investigate as these various issues emerge. And we've seen some of these things, of course, literally just take place over the last number of days. Now, in a sense, that's natural. Events happen, the public becomes more engaged, concerned, and there is that view that, well, surely someone needs to do something, and so the most obvious response is, okay, we'll investigate. But a more proactive approach, both on the investigative side that we just heard about, but potentially also in the way that we might address this through legislation, I think would be valuable. We also have a tendency to look elsewhere. Canada's still small, and so we often talk about not necessarily what our laws look like, but what other laws look like and what they mean for us, whether that is, of course, the GDPR, and in that sense, we're joined by people from around the world who are thinking about much the same kind of things, but so too US laws and other sorts of laws, where very often our frame of reference isn't necessarily what we have here, but rather what takes place elsewhere. Even when we do have rules, they've taken an awful long time to come to fruition. We will finally, of course, get data breach rules put in place and taking effect later in a number of months, but the length of time it has taken for that to run through the legislative and regulatory cycle is certainly not at internet speed, and yet while that has been happening, there have been any number of examples. Sometimes it feels like on a weekly basis of why these kinds of rules were so essential. We saw it as well with the anti-spam legislation. I recognize there are a diversity of views about, but it also took a very long time to see some of those rules come to fruition, and indeed even some shelved altogether with respect to the private right of action. In fact, even when we get studies on these issues, whether it's the Ethics Committee or the most recent consultation that we had on right to de-index or right to be forgotten, I think we've become accustomed in Canada to timelines that really do run almost in decades when it comes to these kinds of changes, as opposed to being far more responsive in the way that we are seeing industry, the way we're seeing technology, the way we're seeing the public itself become more actively engaged and interested in some of these kinds of concerns. I'd in fact argue that if we take a look at the last number of years, certainly the last decade, with all respect to Canada's privacy commissioners at the federal and provincial level, some of whom are who are the best in the world at what they do, and I think are recognized as such. When it comes to Canadian privacy law over the last decade, it is the courts that have had far more influence on the way that we conceive of privacy and the kinds of rules that get implemented in a range of different places. We've got a Supreme Court of Canada that on so many issues has been the leader when it comes to rethinking or at least thinking about what privacy rules look like, whether it's the Spencer decision in terms of reasonable expectation of privacy with respect to our personal information for internet providers, the Duez case, from the Supreme Court of Canada involving Facebook and Debbie Duez, putting the issue of contracts and privacy squarely before the court and the ability or not to try to opt out of certain rules. We've seen it, of course, more recently with respect to privacy on text messages in the Maraca case. And there are many others, VU taking a look at some of these issues in terms of search, and then even in some instances, lower courts that have taken a look at tower dumps and those kinds of issues. Indeed, I would argue that the cutting-edge privacy issues, the place where technology meets privacy in so many instances, we have gotten more answers, we have gotten more framing from courts interpreting the existing law than we certainly have had from legislators, and I would think arguably from commissioners as well. And that's no fault of commissioners. In some ways, they are given the tools and left to interpret them. The courts are left with the same, and the Supreme Court of Canada, of course, when facing these issues, has little choice but to grapple with some of these kinds of issues and concerns. But I think it's high time that we shift some of this dialogue back and we shift some of the framing and the rules back to the rule makers, not just the courts in this regard. And I forgot that I was also going to mention even right to be forgotten with Global 24H case. So if we were to shift from this more reactive approach to a more proactive approach when it comes not just to the enforcement side, as we heard about a few minutes ago, but also with respect to the legislative side, what might some of that look like as we stand at this precipice of PIPEDA at 20? I would say that it's a PIPEDA 2.0 is what we're thinking about, and the foundations, I'd argue, are pretty well known. There are many people in this room that have contributed to the dialogue around some of these issues, the kinds of things that we ought to be thinking about should we choose to move forward in a more aggressive, proactive fashion than we have to date when it comes to some of these legislative-related issues. Now, consent was at the very top of my list, and apparently it's at the very top of the list of the OPC as well. And so what we've just heard is a rethinking of some of the consent-related issues, or at a minimum, an updating of some of the guidance to better reflect the kinds of collection, use, and disclosure of personal information that we have, and how we can better ensure that all Canadians make more informed choices when it comes to the kinds of consents that they provide. Now, I think that discussion that we're going to see take place, and indeed the implementation that we're going to see take place over the next number of months, is incredibly valuable. I was excited just sitting in my chair hearing about these kinds of changes and thinking about what some of those implications might be, not so much for the workload of many people here in this room, but rather what it will look like once it gets operationalized for individual Canadians, in the same way that we've seen any number of other privacy rules change the way people conceive of and understand the information that gets collected, whether it's those annoying emails through GDPR or other related issues if you get a security breach notice and the like. This too has the potential to put this squarely in front of Canadians and say, here's what is actually happening, and enable them to make more informed choices. But as I referred to just a moment ago, I am conscious of the fact that all of this still takes place within the context of guidance and within the context of the current sets of rules. I think it is worth asking the question, and I think I actually have the answer, about whether or not we would be better off with the full certainty of taking these kinds of updated notions of what consent really ought to mean in today's world and ensuring that it is better reflected within our legislation. So too, from an enforcement and penalties perspective, this is an old issue that goes back now really since the very origins of PIPEDA. But we are an outlier when we compare our rules at the federal level with privacy and data protection rules around the world. And you can't have a truly effective set of rules, can't have truly effective legislation without ensuring that the enforcement side has real power. I can recall discussions on that anti-spam task force many years ago as to whether or not PIPEDA could be an effective tool to counter spam. And one of the real questions was that, well, we know who some of the spamming organizations are. They are sometimes engaged in criminal activity, and the question was, why would they even listen to a privacy commissioner whose rules are by design to issue findings and has to ultimately go to a court in order to enforce? And the answer came that, ironically enough, built into the legislation, those same organizations engaged potentially in unlawful activity, and we were operating on the assumption that many were in fact operating with unlawful activity, would be happy to comply, wouldn't be happy, they would be willing to comply with investigations because there were real penalties if you failed to cooperate with an investigation. And yet, at the end of the day, if all you were left with was a finding, it would take years through the court systems before any of that might be enforced. We ought to do better within our legislation from the very outset. We have to recognize, I think, that this law was conceived of and passed at a time when the online digital world looked entirely different from the one that it does today. The phones in our pockets, the social medias that we interact with, the search engines, the wide range of apps and other companies simply didn't exist. Now, there may have been people who were involved in the process at the time that will argue that they had the foresight, that they had the knowledge that all of this was coming. I'm not so sure anyone could have fully predicted what this world looks like today. There were people that did, but I don't think that the design of the law, which was largely, as everyone knows, designed to piggyback over even earlier work through the Canadian Standards Association, really envisioned this kind of world. And so when we engage in activities like a right to de-index and those kinds of consultations, trying to find ways to fit those notions into existing laws, I think with all respect, we do a bit of a disservice. I don't think they fit well within our current rules. Our rules need true updating with respect to online reputation and some of the emerging technological online issues, whether AI or machine learning and the like, and I don't think that the law as it stands today fits as well as it might. Closely aligned with that, of course, is some of the big data related issues, where the collection of data surpasses what almost anyone might have imagined 20 years ago. Our laws haven't kept pace. And while we talk about transparency as being an important notion, and we've seen any number of Canadian companies become more aggressive with respect to issuing transparency reports, we still don't have anything close to uniformity with respect to that. In fact, we have some of the largest, most important organizations, some of the largest data collectors in Canada who still do not issue annual transparency reports. They still tell their customers, in effect, we will collect your data, we'll use it, we may disclose it, there are any number of things we might do with it, but we will not tell you how many requests we've had for that information, the number of disclosures that we've had for that information, the sorts of things that today, for I think most credible organizations operating in the space, would be seen as simply a cost of doing business, would be seen as being part of the quid pro quo for being trusted with our personal data. So when you're a large telecommunications company or a large marketing agency and you still don't issue regular transparency reports, that's a problem. That the law itself still doesn't require this as a core element within the law, I would say is an even bigger problem, and surely part of what a foundational PIPEDA 2.0 ought to look like. Now those are, in a sense, some of the foundations, but I'd like to finish up in my last couple of minutes by highlighting at least 3 principles that I think ought to be imbued within some of that discussion. One is that this ought not to be just a discussion about the private sector. I think what we have also learned, whether through Snowden or otherwise, is the growing realization as we ping-pong between, are we more concerned with what the private sector is doing with our information, or are we more concerned with what government might be doing with our information? I think the answer at the end of the day, of course, is both. That's not to say that people have ill will. I think that most organizations, and virtually all organizations, and virtually all in government have best of intentions, whether it's to keep us secure, whether it's to do business in the right way. And yet what we also know is that if the rules and the enforcement systems don't fully grapple with some of these issues, mistakes are made or more aggressive interpretations of the law are made. And what we end up with is people whose information is collected, sometimes misused, and sometimes used in ways that they never would have imagined or envisioned. Now, from a governmental perspective, the holes here are huge as well. It is well known to everybody in this room that the Privacy Act hasn't been updated for even a longer period of time. And so the government itself doesn't even hold itself to the same standard that it would expect of the private sector, and that represents a problem. Government ought to lead in this regard, lead by example, not just in terms of what it does as a government, but also what it will do when we find these leaders within their political parties. So for example, Bill C-76, just introduced with respect to some changes in terms of our elections and our political parties, ought to embarrass every one of those political parties. The idea that they refuse to hold themselves to even basic standards in terms of the kinds of information that they collect and the disclosures and the rules applicable to that is embarrassing, but it is not surprising. As I think we all know, that whether it's the Do Not Call list or the anti-spam legislation, politicians and political parties have been quick to exempt themselves at the very start of those sorts of pieces of legislation. Now, perhaps in light of things like Cambridge Analytica and others, there is a growing awareness of why that simply can't continue to happen. But a willingness of a government that likes to paint itself as a progressive government on these issues to introduce a piece of legislation that doesn't even have basic kinds of privacy safeguards built in for what has been an obvious hole and an obvious area of potential misuse is, as I say, embarrassment and ought to be addressed. I think it's also bigger than PIPEDA, not just in the context of we've also got to think about government, but in the sense that it is tough, as I even referred to a moment ago, to wrap PIPEDA, private sector or public sector, into some of these emerging issues. And smart cities is a perfect example of a place that sits somewhere between public and private and different layers of government at the same time with global activities as well. I don't know that we've got good answers for what the legislative framework looks like for some of these issues. I know that we need the participants to proactively be concerned with some of these issues. But at the same time, when we think about what the privacy frameworks might look like, we have to, I think, recognize that they don't fit in as neatly as they once did. So too, the overlap of these issues with other areas, and I mentioned a few moments ago, trade law. I don't think people would have much thought about trade negotiations as a place where privacy rules get made. And yet when you have data transfer rules, when you have data localization rules embedded within some of our trade agreements, there is a discussion taking place around the legislative frameworks that we all operate under and think about that largely excludes the very people who are actively engaged in it. We don't get a say, typically, certainly not behind closed doors when these negotiations take place. Much of this is presented a fait accompli, and that, I think, ought to concern us. Finally, I think we need to also be strategic when it comes to these issues. I think other countries have recognized that data protection, privacy, big data, this isn't just about protecting the public. This isn't just about compliance. It's also about being strategic in terms of some of the advantages that we want to ensure that Canadian businesses have. Data localization, for example, is a tough issue. It's tough because there are, I think, perfectly good arguments for why we'd want to retain data within the jurisdiction. There are also good arguments for why we want open networks and want to ensure that data flows freely across those borders, not impeded by restrictions that may not provide real privacy protection. In any event, may lead some to think that they've got more of an illusory privacy protection. And so being strategic with our rules in the hope that we ensure not just that we have a cutting-edge, proactive set of rules that better reflect the current environment today, but also ensure that those rules provide the advantages, economic and otherwise, for the Canadian economy is critically important. I'll conclude by noting that the focus is, as I started, very much right now in this room on this clock. But there's another clock. It has been 6,615 days since PIPEDA took effect on April, I think it was 13th, 2001. So that's not even the clock since this was first introduced. It's rather the clock since the law itself took effect. That's a long time. And as we start thinking about making sure that our rules are relevant, not just from an enforcement perspective, but also ensure that our rules better reflect the environment today, let's start paying attention to this clock and find ways to reset it back to zero. Thanks very much for your attention.